Thank you very much. A clicker? Yeah, there it is. Yes, I'm extremely impatient, but I will try and slow down so that we can make sure that the translators can actually keep up with what I'm saying, okay? Today, I'm going to talk to you for the next 20 minutes about probably one of the defining issues of our times, and that's food. Now, we've heard this and we've seen this headline all over the place. We've got 12 years to save the planet. You know, time is absolutely running out. But the more recent updates from this is really the next 15 months are probably the most critical political window that we have. And really, we need to stop moving from talking, and we have to move into the action phase extremely quickly. Now, last week was an emotional week for a lot of us. We were at the climate summit. You know, Greta was there. There were marches, and we were hoping that countries were going to come forward last Monday with tangible, actual solutions. And they didn't. India did not come. Not a single country came. The G20 countries did not come with tangible solutions, and that's the stage that we're at. So it was quite an emotional time, and that's why groups like this, getting together and saying that we're not going to wait for people to do this, we're going to do it ourselves, are so extremely important. And what is so crazy-making for me is the fact that we all know what the problems are. We've seen pictures like this. We know that Greenland is melting at rates faster than that science ever predicted. We know that the world is actually on fire right now. I mean, fires in Indonesia are at record paces. In Brazil, they're at record paces. We know that forests are being lost and biodiversity are being lost in numbers that we have not seen since the last great extinction. So we've got the two main Earth systems, the climate system, and we've got the biodiversity system that are fundamentally nearing some sort of tipping point. And we have the health. We know that kids and adults are eating what we should not be eating. They're getting larger. People are dying a lot faster than what they used to. There is a global epidemic of people getting larger, faster, and dying of things that they should not be dying of. Why do we accept this? But what does food have to do with this? Now, at the climate summit, food was not discussed. On last Monday, food wasn't mentioned once. And this also, I don't understand why this is still the case. When it comes to health, it's a bit more obvious. We can say, okay, well, the food that we put into our mouths is going to impact our health, okay? That is becoming increasingly more obvious. We can debate in terms of exactly what quantities and exactly what that food is, but we know that if we put bad food into our mouths, it's going to impact us. But what does food have to do with climate? And why is food so fundamentally important to moving forward and solving Paris? Well, when we think about climate change, we think about things like, it's about transport, it's about industry, it's about buildings, it's about electricity. We got to solve these big problems, and yes, we have to solve those problems, but 24% of the problem comes from the food that we eat and the way that we actually produce food. And they have been left out of the conversation so far. Now, when you break it down by actual gases and how it warms, so CO2 coming from all those things like buildings, electricity, transport, is about 62% of the problem. But that leaves 38% of the actual problem out of the conversation. So when you look at food and agriculture, you've got the big gases like nitrous oxide, which mainly comes from fertilizers. You've got methane, which we know comes from livestock mainly. And we've got CO2 from land use, which comes from mainly what we do with tropical forests, cutting down the tropical forests. So you look at these graphs and you start to see if we do not start to think about the food that we eat and how we produce it, we cannot solve Paris. Now, this was part of the fundamental foundation or underpinnings of why we said, well, let's do the Eat Lancet report. Because food has been so rarely discussed in the international discourse. Now, the main idea was, is it possible to achieve healthy diets within the planetary boundaries and do it for every single person on the planet? Now, the key here that you'll see in this is we did not say, is it possible to feed 10 billion people? We know that we can feed people, but is it possible to feed 10 billion people a healthy diet? Now, the first step in this was to determine what a healthy diet is. Now, if I was to do some sort of straw poll here and maybe survey each one of you and say, what do you think healthy food is? What do you think a healthy diet is? I think we'd get very different opinions. You know, how much meat should I be eating? Is red meat bad or good for you? You've probably seen the headlines in the last couple of days that have thrown controversy into the whole red meat debate. Processed food, is that good or bad? Should I be eating sausages or not? How about dairy? We wanted to bring clarity to this. So hundreds of studies, the most comprehensive literature that we looked at, we synthesized that down and to say, what is the latest science saying on what we should eat? Now, when we looked at the healthy diets right here, we did not consider environmental impacts. We just looked at if we want to optimize human health, what's the food that we should be putting into our mouths? And we broke it down by food groups, which you can see up here. We had to give it a daily intake value in order to model it. So don't get hung up on the daily intake value because we can debate whether 250 grams of dairy foods is the right number or not. It's the ranges behind it that we should be looking at. That's where the uncertainty lies. Now, if you want to visualize it as a plate, it looks something like this. Now, we've seen this in a lot of national dietary guidelines. We know that we should be eating a lot of fruits and vegetables. We should be shifting towards whole grains, not processed grains. A lot of plant-sourced proteins, a lot of nuts, and a lot of legumes, and mainly unsaturated fats. If you look at animal-sourced foods, and if you look at dairy, it's a small portion of your daily diet, a very small portion. The daily intake range that we set for the Eat Lancet was 14 grams per day, which comes out to about 100 grams per week. That's a single serving of red meat per week, is what we concluded was the optimal intake for human health. Now, who thinks this is what people are actually eating around the world? In some places, but in a lot of places, we're so far above these boundaries, it's not even funny. So if you look at North American numbers, and I'm going to get into German numbers here soon, that orange dashed line that you see up there is the boundaries for each one of the food groups that we should be setting. Above it is bad, we're eating too much. If it's under that line, we're not eating enough. So you can see, like in North America, red meat is 638% above. Starchy vegetables, too much French fries, too much of what we're calling the optional foods, and not enough of what we're calling the emphasized foods. It's the nuts, it's the legumes, it's the whole grains, it's the fruits, it's the veggies. And if you can find nuts and also legumes up there, you can barely see them. They're those small, teeny wedges. Now, compare this with what's happening in some parts of the world, like Africa or South Asia, where it's under consumption of almost every single food group out there. So we have a state of the planet right now where some places are eating way too much, the EU, North America, at the expense of other parts of the world. Now, we are not saying with this that every single part of the planet has to shift their diets, because some parts of the world, if you look at this, actually have to increase their food intakes, which means they might have to increase their greenhouse gas emissions. But in order to do that, we have to decrease ours. So what we need to start teasing out now, and we can start talking about that today, is where is this actually going to happen? Who's going to be responsible for the shift? Now, looking at the environmental impact of foods, this is a bit small. I apologize for that. We know that red meat is not very good for us. We know that dairy is not very good for us. Animal source foods we should be shifting away from. And if you look at the environmental impact over on your right, those bars indicate the environmental impact in terms of land use and also greenhouse gas emissions. You can see they're so far above the other food groups. So not only our animal source foods have high impact on our health, they also have a high impact on our world. So let's switch to the environment side. So we've got the health side done. We've got the health target set. How about sustainable food? I think the same thing if I was to go around and ask you guys what is sustainable food, I'd get very different answers. Genetically modified food, is that good or bad? Is it local? Is it about greenhouse gases? How do we actually classify sustainable food? What we said is we have to take a more holistic approach and say, if we want to maintain a stable Earth, what are the systems that we should be looking at? And we looked at these six systems. So if you look at climate change, we set global boundaries for these. That's at 5 gigatons. Now, you might be asking yourselves, well, why isn't that 0? And I'll talk about that a bit more. You know, all the other sectors have to get down to 0 by 2050. Why not food? We determined that, you know, we all have to eat. There's going to be 10 billion of us on the planet, and we're all going to have to eat. And there's going to be a consequence or some sort of residual emissions that no matter what we do, we will not be able to get rid of them. And food is the only sector that is special in this way. So we're saying that no matter what we do moving forward, we probably can't reduce emissions from food. So we set the boundary at 5. Land, the 13 million square kilometers is the land that we're using today. It's the same amount of land. So we have to figure out how we're going to produce food on the same amount of land that we're producing it on today and do it for 2 million more people. Freshwater use, nitrogen, phosphorus, and biodiversity. Biodiversity is an interesting one because the current extinction rate is about 1,000 extinctions per 1,000 extinctions. We're saying we have to decrease that down to about 10 extinctions per million species per year. We're so far above that, there has to be drastic changes to that very quickly. Now, what did we do then? So we've got the health targets, we've got the environmental targets. We said, well, is it actually possible to feed 10 billion people by 2050 healthy diets and do it within these 6 boundaries that we set? Well, let's walk through this a little bit. So that orange dashed line that you see right there is the planetary boundary for each one of the systems. That curved red line that you see is where we are going to be in 2050 if we don't do anything. We continue eating and wasting and doing what we're doing today. By 2050, we're going to be 96% above the boundary where we are right now. 96% above. We looked at 3 actions. Well, what would happen if every single person shifted towards the diet that I just showed you? What would happen if we halved food loss and waste? And what would happen if we changed how we produced food? Now, in order to reduce emissions down within the boundary, which one of those 3 actions do you think has the most impact? What do you think? Having food loss and waste, shifting diets, or production? Any guesses? Shifting diets? Absolutely. It's the #1 thing that we can do. It reduces it nearly 96%. Even if we didn't do anything, just shifting diets will get us pretty much all the way there. Changing production practices helps, but it doesn't help in terms of greenhouse gas emissions as much as we'd like. It's anywhere between 18 to 22% reduction. Having food loss and waste is about 12%. Now, this is an interesting one because a lot of people say greenhouse gas emissions are huge coming from food loss and waste, and that's true. But it's only true if you couple in the land use and the land loss that comes from actually the food loss. If you only look at the methane emitted from food loss, it's actually not that great. So food loss and waste, what we did is we only looked at the methane that comes from rotting food. When you throw it into a garbage and it rots, it's not that great when you look at the methane released. So food loss and waste, what we concluded, is not going to be one of those solutions that we need to turn to as the #1 solution for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The best thing we need to do is we need to combine all 3 actions and do them at the same time. That gets us below the boundary. Now, I'm going to put up the other environmental areas, and you'll see what happens. And the point of this is in order to understand impact and in order to understand what to do moving forward, we have to have a very detailed understanding of what action impacts what environmental area. We have to move away from the simple solutions, these panaceas of saying this single thing is going to solve the problem, because it won't. We need a combination of everything. So this is what it looks like for cropland use, water, nitrogen, phosphorus, and also biodiversity loss. And just looking at cropland, you can see the difference here. Shifting diets doesn't get us below the boundary. It's because if we shift it from animal source foods to plant source foods, we still have to grow food. And if we do it inefficiently, it's going to take a lot of land. So the number one action that will help us save land is to change how we produce food and do it a lot more efficiently. And this is where food loss and waste helps when you're looking at cropland use and water use and other things. But this is just showing the impact if we combine all the actions. And that gets us within the uncertainty zone or within the boundary for each one of them. So the main story here is it can actually be done. We can actually produce food for 10 billion people and do it within the boundaries. That's the good news. The bad news is it's going to be tight, extremely tight. And we have very little wiggle room to actually get this done. Now, this is not just news from the Eat Lancet. This has really been a landmark year when we're talking about food. The IPCC report, which just came out in August, said very similar things. WRI came out with a report last December which said very similar things, and we just launched this other report, the Exponential Climate Action Roadmap, which lays out specific solutions for each one of the sectors, which also says the same thing about food. The science is becoming clear on this, and it's now time to act. So, in the spirit of what we're doing here, now what? And I was told that we should be talking about, well, what are the strategies moving forward? Now, where do we go from here? Well, I'm not going to give specific solutions for Germany because that's up to you guys to figure out what we do in Germany. And this is where we need to go, is individual countries need to wrestle with what is our position, what are those levers within our country moving forward. There are no solutions that somebody can fly in and say, this is what you have to do. This is when the hard work starts. But let's just looking at the roadmap. One of the first things that we need to do in terms of moving forward is we need to understand what kind of scale and pace of change we're looking at. And this is climate change. You've got greenhouse gas emissions over on the y-axis, and moving forward, we have time from 2020 to 2050. Broken down by sectors. You've got energy at the top, industry, buildings, transport. Food is the yellow. Nature-based sources, which are forests and everything, is a light green, and the nature-based sinks is a dark green. And what you see here is that every single sector, energy, industry, buildings, transport, nature-based sources, have to decarbonize by 2050, essentially have to get down to zero. Food has to remain constant at that 5 gigaton limit that we set. And what has to happen is we have to start turning land and agriculture from being a source of emissions into a sink. So we have to, and this is one of those things that people don't like to talk about, the only way that we will achieve Paris going forward is to pull and store massive amounts of carbon dioxide. Now, industry and people are talking about, well, we can do it through carbon capture and storage, and we can put carbon scrubs on like smokestacks, and you know what? There is no technology out there that has been proven that actually demonstrates that we can store carbon, except one thing which we know without a doubt that actually stores carbon, and that's trees. It's a very simple solution. Plant trees. Plant trees, convert agriculture into a source, and we can actually start to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Let's look at Germany. Now, Bernard, I'd like to talk to you about the National Dietary Guidelines and get your opinion on this, on if you feel we're close or not. This is some unpublished research which we're going to be coming out with next month, where we look at the G20 countries and what are current consumption patterns and emission patterns in these. So if you look at Germany, we've got 3 different lines here. We've got the blue line, which is the current consumption, what people are actually eating here. You've got the red line, which is the National Dietary Guideline, what we're saying we should be eating. Government says this is what you should eat. And you have the gray line, which is the Eat Lancet recommendations that I just showed you. You can see here that in Germany, you're not eating enough of the good stuff, fruits, veggies, nuts, legumes. You're eating way too much of what we're calling the optional foods or the bad foods. Red meat, a lot of red meat, not enough fish, a lot of eggs, and a lot of dairy. Now, looking at this compared to other G20 countries, Germany is 5th when it comes to red meat consumption. Australia is way out in front, and of course, theirs is quite low. When you look at dairy consumption, Germany's 1st. Probably might be the highest dairy consuming country in the world is the data that we have. So a lot of meat and a lot of dairy being consumed. Now, what would it look like if everybody ate like a German? So if everybody ate like a German today, with current consumption patterns, if you look at the BMK, we would be nearly 300% above the planetary boundary. That's if every single person in the world ate like everybody here within this country. If everybody ate like an Indian, we'd be below the boundary. If we followed the national dietary guidelines, we'd still be nearly 160% above the planetary boundary. So it appears that the German national dietary guidelines are not good enough yet, and work needs to be done. If you look at change in production practices, and I don't have numbers specific for Germany, but if you look at the yellow, that's if we don't do anything by 2050, what we should be producing. If you look at the green, this is if we follow the planetary health diet, what types of food should we actually be producing. And you can see, following the planetary health diet, almost no increase in cereals globally. We are producing enough, and there's so much focus that goes into rice and corn and wheat. We're producing enough right now. We don't need to produce more. What we do need to produce more are things like vegetables and fruits, a lot more fish, a lot more legumes, and a lot more nuts. We need to shift production practices away from what's being produced now into the foods that we're calling more healthy. Red meat production has to decrease by 65%. How do we achieve it? Last couple slides here as well. There's a lot of things that we can do and a lot of debate here. And this is a very interesting debate. Is it top-down or is it bottom-up? How do we actually do this? Now, you can do anything from do nothing, which is the softest intervention that you can have, to eliminating choice from the top, which is the hardest thing that you can do. Now, it seems like we tend to, in a lot of these forums, we want to talk about education of the public, changing behavior, those softer approaches, those bottom up. Now, we do need that, but there's no evidence that suggests that those types of interventions really work. The hard choices, given the time frame that we're looking at, we also really have to start looking at. How do we actually start to eliminate choices, restrict choices, and almost, dare I say, force, but make it so that consumers will tend to buy healthy foods? Maybe because they're cheaper. Maybe because the unhealthy foods are taxed. Maybe those are some of the things that we need to talk about. But what we can't do is we can't just focus on bottom up and saying that's the answer, or top down. It has to be some sort of combination of both. And what works here in Germany is something that we're going to have to discuss. What we don't want to do is look at single solutions and panaceas and start shaming people for what they're doing. Like flight shaming. Drives me crazy when we want to step on a single issue and say, this is what's wrong. Let's flight shame people, and if you fly, it's no good, and if you don't, well, it's good. Well, when you look at it, when you start to educate yourself about the facts, flying is 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions. 2%. 12% of all the transport emissions. So, yes, we have to reduce those. But we should not call out a single industry or a single action, because what we need to do is we need to do them all. We need to reduce our travel. We need to change our diets. We need to stop using electricity. We need to do all of it. We need to stop consuming less. So instead of shaming people for doing things, we need to start figuring out how to encourage people to do them instead. We also have to start integrating health and the environment. We can't just be focusing on one. Impossible Burgers, I think it's a great transition food, and they might have lower greenhouse gas emissions. However, are they healthy? And the debate is out there on if they're actually healthy. And if we're only looking at greenhouse gas emissions on that health, we might be solving one problem but actually creating another. Now, we all want to do something, and I think we all struggle every single day trying to figure out, what can I do as an individual? What is the action that I can take? And one of the greatest actions that you can take right now today is food. You have the power in your hands and on your plate to change your food 3 times every single day. What you serve yourself, what you serve your kids, and that might have the greatest impact of any other action that you can take on your health and also on Earth. And with that, I thank you for this opportunity and for introducing the Eat Lancet, and I look forward to discussing this further later. Thank you.